My son locked me in a nursing home to steal my late wife's estate. For 3 weeks, I ate cold oatmeal under fluorescent lights while Marcus emptied the vault he thought belonged to him. But Miriam had spent 7 years hiding the truth inside 200 antique clocks, and every single one of them was ticking down to the moment her trap would snap shut around his throat. This is how she destroyed him from beyond the grave. Before I step through that door and uncover who the wolf truly is, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this story from? Comment your city or country below. Subscribe to follow this journey. This is a fictional story dramatized to create meaningful and valuable reflections. 4 months earlier, I sat in the leather chair across from Philip Hartman's mahogany desk, the brass nameplate catching the weak October sun that filtered through the blinds of his Savannah office. The air was thick with the smell of old paper and toner, that specific institutional scent that clings to places where lives are reduced to signatures and filing cabinets. Philip had been our family attorney for 31 years. A man whose hands now trembled when he adjusted his bifocals, though his mind remained sharper than the letter opener he kept beside his inkwell. I expected nothing from this meeting. A few bank accounts to close. Maybe the title transfer on our modest 2-bedroom on Abercorn Street. The kind of administrative grief that reduces a 33-year marriage to a stack of paper and a notary stamp. Miriam had been gone 4 months, taken by a stroke that arrived without warning on a Tuesday afternoon, while I was calibrating a mixing board at the studio downtown. One moment she was alive. The next, the paramedics were asking me to identify the woman I had shared every frequency of my existence with since 1991. Philip cleared his throat, the sound dry and deliberate in the quiet office. "There is one final item, Mr. Caldwell," he said, sliding a heavy manila folder across the polished wood. "Something your wife insisted be held in a separate trust until this specific date." My defensive instincts sharpened immediately, the same instincts that had spent 40 years isolating rogue frequencies in recording studios, detecting the one wrong note in a symphony of sound. Miriam did not have separate accounts. "Philip," I replied, hearing the edge in my own voice. "We were transparent about everything. Every bill, every savings goal, every insurance payment. We built our life on a single frequency, and I never heard static, or so I had believed. 33 years. You think you know the harmonic structure of a person sleeping 3 feet from you until a lawyer hands you a key to a melody you never heard her play." Philip did not argue. He simply waited, his weathered hands folded on the desk, giving me the space a man needs when the ground shifts beneath him. I opened the folder, and the weight of it felt like holding a stone pulled from the bottom of a river. Inside was a deed. Not for anything in Georgia. It was for a property in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina. 30 acres of forested land, a restored cabin, and an adjoining workshop. The purchase price was listed at $2.4 million, paid in full 6 years ago using her family inheritance from her grandmother's estate in Vermont. I stared at Miriam's signature. Those precise loops I had seen on 1,000 grocery lists and birthday cards and Christmas tags. The elegant script that once wrote me love notes on Post-it notes stuck to the bathroom mirror. She had used it to sign away millions without ever mentioning a word across our dinner table. How do you reconcile the woman who kissed you goodbye every morning with a woman who built an empire in a mountain range 400 miles away? I looked up at Philip, my vision blurring at the edges. "She bought this 6 years ago," I said, the words tasting like metal on my tongue. "In secret." Philip leaned forward, his pale eyes softening behind those thick lenses. "She was not hiding it from you in the way you think, Warren," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was building it for you. She knew your ears were failing from decades in the studio. She wanted you to have something that lived in silence, something that would outlast the frequencies you could no longer hear. The revelation should have been a comfort. Instead, it felt like discovering a room in your own house that you never knew existed. A room with furniture you cannot recognize and photographs of a life you were never invited to witness." I turned the pages of the folder, my calloused fingers catching on the heavy bond paper. There were insurance policies for something called the Caldwell Horological Archive, maintenance contracts for climate control systems, security installation receipts for motion sensors and reinforced steel doors. This was not a cabin in the woods. This was a fortress. Philip reached into his desk drawer and produced a small velvet pouch. He turned it upside down over his palm, and a single brass key fell out, catching the dim light with a warm, antique glow. The key was old, ornate, with a winding mechanism built into the bow that I recognized immediately as horology craftsmanship. It was the kind of key that belonged to a clock, not a door. "She asked me to give you this on this exact date," Philip said. "And she asked me to give you this as well." He slid a small cream envelope across the desk. Miriam's handwriting on the front was hurried. Unlike her usual graceful script, the letters pressed deep into the paper, as if she had been writing against time itself. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the slight raised texture of the ink beneath my fingertips. The room was silent except for the mechanical tick of the grandfather clock in the corner of Philip's office, a sound that had never bothered me before, but now felt like a pulse counting down to something I could not yet name. I broke the seal. Inside was a single index card, the kind Miriam used for her restoration notes. 7 words in red ink, underlined twice. "Do not trust anyone who asks about the 7th clock, Warren. Not even blood." The grandfather clock in the corner struck 4. The sound rolled through the office like a warning bell, and I felt the brass key grow heavy in my palm, as if it had absorbed the weight of every secret my wife had carried alone for 6 years. I looked at Philip. Searching his face for answers he clearly was not authorized to give. He simply nodded toward the deed and said, "The property is yours now, Mr. Caldwell. What you find there is between you and her." I folded the index card and placed it in my breast pocket, directly over my heart, where the vibration of my own pulse could keep it company. Miriam had always said that every great timepiece contained a message from its maker. I was beginning to understand that my wife had not just left me a property. She had left me a mechanism, and I had no idea yet how many gears were already turning inside it, or whose hands were reaching for the winding key. The drive from Savannah to the Blue Ridge took 6 hours. But the distance between the man I thought I was and the husband Miriam actually needed felt like something no odometer could measure. I left before dawn, the brass key sitting in the cup holder beside my thermos of black coffee, catching the orange glow of every streetlight as I passed through the sleeping neighborhoods of the Georgia coast. The hum of the tires against the interstate was a low drone, a frequency I had spent my career trying to eliminate from recordings. And yet now, it was the only sound keeping me company on a road I never knew existed in my own marriage. For 33 years, Miriam had taken quarterly trips. Restoration conferences, she called them. The American Horological Society in Cincinnati, the Antiquarian Clock Guild in Philadelphia. She would pack her small leather suitcase, the one with the brass clasps that clicked like tiny heartbeats when she locked them, kiss me on the forehead, and disappear for 4 or 5 days at a time. I never questioned it. Why would I? She came home smelling of museum dust and wood polish, her fingers sometimes stained with the particular amber of shellac, her eyes bright with the satisfaction of a woman who had spent her days among beautiful, intricate things. I was a fool. Not because I failed to notice deception, but because I confused contentment for completeness. I heard the harmony of our life together and assumed there were no instruments playing beneath the threshold of my perception. But Miriam had been composing an entire symphony in a key I could not hear. And now, I was driving toward the concert hall she had built in secret. The landscape shifted as I crossed into North Carolina, the flat coastal plains giving way to rolling foothills that rose like the slow crescendo of an orchestral swell. The GPS guided me off the main highway and onto a series of increasingly narrow roads that wound through corridors of red and gold maple, the October canopy so dense it filtered the morning sun into a warm amber haze. The air changed too, growing cooler and sharper with each mile of elevation gained, carrying the mineral scent of mountain streams and the clean bite of pine. The final turn brought me onto a private road, unmarked except for a small brass plaque bolted to a stone post that read Caldwell Property in a typeface I recognized as Miriam's preferred font from her restoration labels. The road was paved with expensive crushed granite, the kind that whispers rather than crunches under tires, and it wound through a dense stand of old-growth oak for nearly a quarter-mile before the trees parted and the cabin revealed itself. I use the word cabin because that is what the deed said. But the structure before me was no cabin. It was a two-story craftsman lodge with a wraparound porch built from reclaimed chestnut, flanked by a separate workshop building that was nearly twice its size. Solar panels lined the workshop roof with military precision. I counted 4 security cameras before I even stepped out of the car, their small, dark lenses tracking my movement with an automated awareness that made the hair on my forearms rise. The property was immaculate, the grounds maintained with a discipline that spoke of daily attention. Flower beds lined the gravel path to the front door, the last autumn blooms of chrysanthemum and sage still holding their color against the coming cold. This was not a hobby. This was an institution. I stood beside my car for a long moment, listening. The sound engineer in me could not help but catalog the acoustic signature of the place. Whined through high canopy, a frequency around 400 hertz, a distant creek, its water tumbling over rock in an irregular rhythm that no metronome could replicate. The faint mechanical hum of the solar inverters on the workshop roof, and beneath it all, if I strained, something else. A collective vibration from inside the workshop, so subtle it was more felt than heard. The almost imperceptible pulse of hundreds of tiny mechanisms moving in synchronization, clocks, hundreds of them, breathing together like a single organism behind closed walls. A man emerged from the side of the workshop, wiping his hands on a cloth that smelled of brass polish and mineral oil. He was roughly my age, perhaps a few years younger, with the kind of weathered face that comes from spending decades outdoors, and the careful posture of someone who works with precision instruments. His eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that was not hostile, but deeply evaluating, as if he were checking my tolerances the way a machinist checks a calibration gauge. "You must be Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice a low baritone with the rounded vowels of a man raised somewhere in the Appalachian foothills. His name was Reggie Thornton, and he told me he had been the property's caretaker and primary restoration technician for 5 years. Miriam had hired him after his own shop in Asheville closed, offering him a salary, a residence in the cottage behind the workshop, and a purpose that he described with a reverence usually reserved for church. "She said you would come in February," he continued, studying my face the way one studies a clock face for imperfections. "Not October. I was not supposed to meet you for another 4 months. February would have been my 62nd birthday." The date Miriam had apparently chosen as the unveiling of whatever this place truly was. But a stroke does not consult calendars. And here I stood, 4 months early, holding a key that did not fit any lock I had found so far. Reggie seemed to understand this, without explanation. "Grief has its own schedule," he said simply, tucking the polishing cloth into his back pocket. She accounted for that too. He did not invite me inside immediately. Instead, he walked me around the perimeter of the workshop, pointing out the reinforced foundation, the backup generator, the independent water supply. Each detail was another layer of revelation. Miriam had not just built a place to store things. She had built a place to survive things. The workshop windows were triple-paned with UV filtering. The doors were commercial-grade steel behind their craftsman wood facades. There was even a seismic sensor embedded in the foundation, designed to alert the climate system if the ground shifted enough to threaten the contents inside. How do you mourn a woman you are only now beginning to meet? I had buried my wife 4 months ago, and yet here she was, more alive in these mountains than she had ever seemed in our quiet kitchen on Abercorn Street. We reached the back of the workshop where a set of stone steps descended to a heavy door set into the hillside, like the entrance to a root cellar or a bank vault. Reggie produced a key from his belt. a modern electronic fob that beeped twice when he pressed it against the steel plate beside the frame. The locks disengaged with a hydraulic sigh that I felt in my chest. "The clocks upstairs are impressive, Mr. Caldwell," Reggie said. Pausing with his hand on the door handle, he turned to look at me, and for the first time I saw something in his expression that went beyond professional respect. It was protectiveness, a fierce, quiet loyalty to whatever lay beyond this threshold. "But the clocks are the distraction," he continued, his voice dropping to a frequency barely above the ambient hum of the mountain. "The truth is what she built underneath." He pulled the door open, and a rush of cool, precisely controlled air met my face, carrying with it the faint scent of aged wood, mineral oil, and something else, something that smelled like time itself. If time had a fragrance, cold brass and ancient lubricant, and the particular dusty sweetness of mechanisms that have been turning for centuries. The staircase descended into an amber glow, and the sound that rose from below was unlike anything I had ever recorded in 40 years of audio engineering. It was the collective heartbeat of 200 antique clocks, ticking in the dark, waiting for someone to finally listen. The descent felt like sinking into a frequency I had never been able to isolate in 40 years of sound engineering. Each step carried me deeper beneath the mountain, the temperature dropping in precise increments that my skin registered before my mind could process. The stone walls of the staircase were smooth, professionally finished, and embedded with small amber LEDs that cast a warm glow against the gray mineral surface. The air transitioned from the crisp mountain pine above to something entirely different below, cool, filtered, carrying the complex, layered scent of aged wood, brass, lubricant, and the particular dusty sweetness that only centuries-old mechanisms possess. At the base of the stairs, Reggie punched a code into a keypad mounted beside a reinforced steel door. The seal broke with a soft pneumatic hiss, and the door swung inward on silent hydraulic hinges. The sound hit me before the light did. 200 voices speaking at once in a language made entirely of mechanical precision. The collective ticking was not chaotic, it was orchestral. A symphony of tiny hammers striking tiny gears at 200 slightly different tempos, creating a wall of rhythmic sound that vibrated in my chest like standing inside a cathedral organ. Then the lights hummed to life, and I lost the ability to speak. The vault stretched before me in a long, cathedral-like gallery, the ceiling vaulted in reinforced concrete and lined with acoustic dampening panels that I recognized from my studio work. Floor-to-ceiling mahogany display cases ran along both walls, each one climate-controlled behind UV-filtered glass, each one illuminated by soft amber LEDs that made the brass and gold of the mechanisms inside glow as if lit from within. The floor was polished concrete, seamless, with embedded humidity sensors blinking green at regular intervals. 200 antique clocks, pocket watches in velvet-lined drawers, mantel clocks on individual pedestals, wall clocks mounted on custom brackets, a grandfather clock from what appeared to be the 1700s standing in an alcove like a sentinel. Each piece was catalogued with a small brass plaque bearing its origin, date, maker, and a condition grade, written in Miriam's precise handwriting. I walked along the first row, my reflection ghosting across the glass, and felt the weight of 6 years of secret labor pressing against my ribs. "I did not even know she liked clocks this much," I said, my voice sounding hollow against the dampened acoustics. We had a single clock in our house, a digital alarm on the nightstand that she replaced every 2 years when the battery contacts corroded. Reggie walked beside me, his hands clasped behind his back in the posture of a museum docent who has given this tour 100 times in his mind, but never aloud. "She did not like clocks, Mr. Caldwell," he replied, his voice low and reverent. "She understood them. There is a significant difference." He explained that Miriam had spent 6 years acquiring pieces at estate sales, international auctions, and private dealers across Europe. She had restored many of them herself in the workshop above, rebuilding movements, regilding cases, replacing worn mainsprings with period-appropriate reproductions she commissioned from a specialist in Geneva. The total appraised value, Reggie told me as we reached the center of the gallery, currently sits at $12.3 million. Insured separately from the property, through a specialty firm in London, $12 million. My wife, who negotiated the price of tomatoes at the farmer's market every Saturday, who insisted we keep the thermostat at 68 to save on the gas bill, who drove a 15-year-old Subaru because she said it still had good bones. That woman had curated a collection worth more than I would earn in 3 lifetimes, and never once let the weight of it register across our dinner table. How many frequencies exist in a marriage that one person simply cannot hear? I had spent my career believing that, with the right equipment, any sound could be captured. But Miriam had operated on a wavelength that no microphone I owned could detect. We reached the far end of the gallery, and Reggie stopped before a separate display case. This one was different from the others. Larger, freestanding, constructed from what appeared to be bulletproof glass, mounted on a mahogany base with its own independent climate system. Inside, arranged on individual velvet pedestals like crown jewels, sat 7 clocks. They were not the most ornate in the collection, nor obviously the most valuable, but their placement spoke of a hierarchy that transcended market price. "These 7 are not for sale, Mr. Caldwell," Reggie said, and I heard his voice shift into a register that was almost protective, the way a father's voice changes when speaking about his children. "These 7 are her voice. She specifically said you would only hear her when the wolves started howling." I pressed my palm against the cool glass, studying each one. A Black Forest cuckoo clock, with wolves carved into the casing. A Swiss pocket watch, in a silver case. An Art Deco mantel clock with geometric jade inlays. A German anniversary clock with rotating pendulum. A French carriage clock with beveled glass panels. An American railroad regulator, with a heavy brass dial. And at the center, taller than the rest, an English long-case clock from what the plaque indicated was 1742, its face dark with age. Its pendulum still swinging in the controlled silence, with the patience of something that had been keeping time since before this country existed. 7 clocks. 7 secrets. And a warning about wolves that I was beginning to hear approaching through the static. Reggie then guided me back toward the entrance, but paused at a display case housing a particularly elegant Vienna regulator from 1902. Its mahogany case was adorned with hand-carved musical motifs, and its pendulum swung with a hypnotic precision that drew my eye like a metronome. "She spent the most time with this one," Reggie said, running his finger along the edge of the case without touching the glass. "Said it reminded her of you. Something about the rhythm." He opened the case with a small tool from his belt, reached behind the pendulum assembly, and withdrew a leather-bound journal that had been tucked into a cavity between the movement and the back panel. The leather was soft, worn at the edges from frequent handling, and it smelled of Miriam, sandalwood and old paper, and the faint chemical sweetness of conservation-grade adhesive. My hands trembled as I took it from him. The weight of it, both negligible and enormous. I opened to the first page, and the sight of her handwriting made my knees weaken. Those precise, elegant loops that I had read on 33 years of grocery lists and love notes, and the single Christmas card she wrote me every December without fail. But these words were not a list or a greeting. They were a confession. "Warren, I am writing this because I will not survive long enough to say it aloud." The collective ticking of 200 clocks filled the silence that followed, each mechanical heartbeat marking the seconds since my wife had written those words, counting forward into a future she already knew she would not see. I stood beneath the amber light of her underground cathedral, holding her voice in my hands, and felt the architecture of everything I believed about my marriage begin to shift on its foundation. Reggie left me alone in the vault that night. He set a thermos of black coffee on the workbench near the door and disappeared up the stone staircase with the quiet efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this exit many times in his mind. I sat on a wooden stool beneath the amber light, the leather journal open on my knees, and read my wife's voice for the first time since her funeral. She began with a date. March 14th. 3 years before the stroke. The entry described a Tuesday appointment at Emory University Hospital in Atlanta. A consultation, she had told me, was a routine follow-up for her migraines. The neurologist had found a mass, inoperable, deep in the temporal lobe. Terminal, with a median survival window of 2 to 5 years. She had been given a countdown, and she had chosen to carry it alone. I stared at the rows of clocks, their pendulums swinging in perfect mechanical indifference. 3 years. Every morning of those 3 years she had poured my coffee, kissed my cheek, and walked out the door, carrying a death sentence in her pocket like loose change. The rage I felt was not directed at her. It was directed at myself. At 40 years of training my ears to detect the slightest imperfection in a sound wave, and yet I could not hear the distress signal my own wife was broadcasting from 3 feet away at our breakfast table. She wrote that she chose silence, not out of cruelty but out of engineering. If I told Warren, she wrote, he would stop living and start waiting. He would transform our remaining years into a vigil instead of a life. I refused to make him a watchman over my decline. But woven between entries about the property and the collection was a second narrative. A darker one. Marcus. My son's name first appeared 18 months before Miriam's death. He had called her asking for $40,000 to cover a temporary cash flow problem with his startup. She declined. 6 weeks later, $60,000. She declined again. The third request came 4 months later. And this time Marcus appeared at our house on Abercorn Street on a Saturday when he knew I would be at the studio. He sat at our kitchen table and told his mother that her refusal was selfish, that if she truly loved him, she would not force him to seek alternative funding from people who did not share her patience. She described his eyes. Cold, she wrote, calculating in a way that reminded me of watching a clock mechanism stripped of its decorative case. Just gears and springs with no beauty to justify their function. After that visit, Miriam hired a forensic accountant through Nathan Chen, a patent attorney she had consulted about the collection. The findings filled an entire section of the journal. Marcus's startup did not exist. It had never existed. No product, no employees, no revenue. The money he claimed to need had been diverted into personal accounts tied to margin trading platforms. $340,000 in debt. Not from failed entrepreneurship, but from gambling dressed in a suit and a pitch deck. But the entry that froze my blood was dated 6 months before her stroke. Marcus had begun researching Georgia guardianship law, the legal mechanisms for declaring a parent mentally incompetent. He had consulted attorneys. He had bookmarked articles about conservatorship proceedings. He had searched for psychiatric evaluators who specialized in cognitive decline assessments. How do you reconcile the boy who used to fall asleep in your lap with the man who is drafting blueprints to demolish your life? Miriam's response was not panic. It was architecture. The final section laid out the system of 7 clocks with the precision of an engineering schematic. Each clock contained specific evidence, sealed in a waterproof compartment, accessible only in sequence. Clock 1 through 7. Each one a gear and a mechanism designed to destroy Marcus's scheme at the exact moment it reached its fullest extension. The 7th clock holds the detonator, she wrote in red ink. Do not open it until you are standing in front of a judge, Warren. Let him build his tower as high as he dares. The higher he climbs, the further he falls. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The vault hummed around me, 200 mechanical hearts beating in patient synchronization. She had known the wolf was inside our family. She had watched him sharpen his teeth at our dinner table, and instead of screaming, she had built a trap so precise, so patient, that it could wait years for the spring to release. Then I heard it. A sound that did not belong to the 200 voices in the vault. The crunch of tires on granite gravel, muffled by stone and steel but unmistakable to ears trained to isolate anomalies in complex soundscapes. I checked my watch, 11:14 at night. I climbed the stairs and found Reggie already at the workshop window, his silhouette rigid against the moonlight. His phone showed the front gate camera feed. A black SUV sat at the entrance, its headlights cutting through the mountain dark like the eyes of something hungry. "We have visitors, Mr. Caldwell," Reggie said, his voice dropping into a register I had not heard from him before, and they were not invited. The clocks below us kept their rhythm, indifferent and precise, counting the seconds toward something Miriam had predicted with the accuracy of a master horologist reading the tension of a mainspring. The wolves had arrived exactly on schedule. Marcus did not bring flowers or condolences. He brought a leather messenger bag that smelled of expensive cologne and ambition, a woman I had never met, and a smile that reminded me of the exact moment I stopped recognizing my own son. They arrived properly at 9 the next morning. The black SUV from the night before now parked brazenly in the gravel circle, as if it had always belonged there. I stood on the porch with my coffee, watching them emerge into the mountain air like investors arriving to inspect a acquisition target. My son had changed since the funeral. The grief that had softened his features 4 months ago was gone, replaced by something leaner and more angular. He wore a charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck, the uniform of a man who wanted to be mistaken for someone with vision. His handshake when he reached the porch was firm and brief, more transaction than affection. "Dad, you look good up here," he said, his eyes already scanning past me toward the workshop building. "The mountain air suits you." The woman beside him extended her hand with the practiced warmth of someone who shakes hands professionally. Jade Kim. She introduced herself as Marcus's partner, though the word carried a deliberate ambiguity that could mean romantic or business or both. She was younger than Marcus by a few years, sharp-featured, with intelligent dark eyes that moved across the property with the systematic precision of an appraiser cataloging square footage. Her handshake was dry and firm, and she held it 1 second longer than necessary, studying my face the way I had seen estate agents study elderly homeowners. Within the first hour, Marcus had already asked about property tax assessments, annual maintenance costs, and whether the workshop had been inspected for commercial zoning compliance. He framed each question as concern. "Just making sure you are not overextending yourself, Dad. This is a lot for one person to manage alone." But I heard the frequency beneath the words. I had spent my career isolating hidden signals in complex audio, and Marcus was broadcasting his intentions on a channel he thought I could not receive. Jade separated from us mid-morning, claiming she wanted to explore the grounds while Marcus and I caught up. I watched her through the kitchen window as she circled the workshop, her phone raised at calculated angles, photographing the security cameras, the solar array, the reinforced doors. She was not admiring the architecture. She was cataloging vulnerabilities. Have you ever sat across from your own blood and felt the temperature of the room drop with every word they speak? That is what dinner felt like that evening. Reggie had prepared a simple meal in the cabin kitchen, the smell of roasted chicken and rosemary filling the space with a domestic warmth that felt increasingly fraudulent as Marcus guided the conversation toward his true purpose. He waited until the plates were cleared before he made his pitch. His voice shifted into a register I recognized from his phone calls to Miriam, that smooth, persuasive cadence she had documented in her journal. "Dad, let us be realistic," he said, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "You are 61 years old. You spent your career in a sound booth, not managing rural property. This place is beautiful, but it is a liability without proper oversight." He proposed what he called a management transition, a partial transfer of decision-making authority to a professional firm that could maximize the property's value while reducing my burden. He even had a name ready: Ridgeline Development Partners. The words fell from his mouth with rehearsed fluency, and I noticed Jade watching me from across the table with the focused attention of someone measuring a reaction in real time. She was not his girlfriend. She was his handler. "Your mother built this with her hands, Marcus," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Every beam, every clock, every inch of this property carries her fingerprints. And you are talking about it like a balance sheet with a negative return." He did not flinch. He smiled, that lean, predatory expression that Miriam had described in her journal as gears without beauty. "Mom would have wanted us to be practical, Dad," he said. She was a restorer. She understood that sometimes you have to disassemble something to preserve what matters. I set my napkin on the table and stood, the chair scraping against the hardwood, like a single discordant note in an otherwise silent room. Your mother understood mechanisms, Marcus, I said, looking down at him. She understood exactly how every gear connected to every spring. And she understood what happens when someone tries to force a winding key that does not belong to them. Something flickered behind his eyes. Not guilt. Calculation. He was recalibrating, adjusting his approach the way a gambler adjusts his bet after reading the table. He leaned back, spreading his hands in a gesture of false surrender. Just think about it, Dad. No pressure. We are here all week. All week. The words settled in my stomach like a cold stone. That night, I could not sleep. I sat in the darkened study on the second floor, watching the moonlight paint silver lines across the mountain ridge, when the soft ping of Reggie's security notification broke the silence. I opened the app on my phone, the screen casting a blue glow across my face, and watched the infrared feed from the workshop cameras. Jade stood at the vault door, her phone flashlight illuminating the keypad. Her fingers moved with purpose, punching in combinations with the speed of someone who had done research. The first code failed. The second code failed. The third code failed. And the system triggered its lockout protocol. The electromagnetic bolts engaged with a heavy metallic thud that I could hear faintly through the cabin walls, and Jade stepped back, her face a mask of controlled frustration in the green wash of the infrared camera. She was not exploring. She was not curious. She was executing a reconnaissance mission with specific objectives, and the vault had been her target from the moment the SUV crossed the property line. I watched her retreat across the gravel path toward the guest cottage, her silhouette dissolving into the mountain dark. The security system sent an automated lockout report to Reggie's phone, and within 30 seconds, a single text appeared on my screen from his number. 3 words that confirmed everything Miriam had written in her journal. She tried 3 times. I turned off my phone and sat in the dark, listening to the faint, collective pulse of 200 clocks breathing beneath the workshop floor. My son had not come to grieve with me. He had come to rob me. And the woman beside him was not a partner in love. She was a partner in theft. The gaslighting started with the small things. My reading glasses moved from the side table where I always placed them to the kitchen counter. My coffee, which I had drunk black since 1982, switched to decaf without discussion. The thermostat lowered 3 degrees overnight, so that I woke shivering, disoriented in the mountain cold. Each incident was minor enough to dismiss on its own, but they arrived with a rhythm that my trained ears could not ignore, a deliberate pattern, like a metronome set to the tempo of someone else's composition. Marcus had been at the cabin for 7 days. 7 days of what he called helping Dad settle in. 7 days of small adjustments to my environment that accumulated like dust on a lens, each particle insignificant until the image became impossible to see clearly. Every conversation ended with the same phrase delivered in a tone of gentle, poisonous concern. "Dad, are you sure you remember that correctly?" He said it when I mentioned the security codes. He said it when I referenced the insurance documents Philip had given me. He said it when I told him dinner was at 6 and he claimed I had said 7. On the 4th day, I found my car keys in the refrigerator. I had not put them there. I knew this. With the same certainty that I knew the frequency of concert. A is 440 hertz. But Marcus shook his head with a slow, sad expression that made me want to shatter something. "Dad, this is the 3rd time this week," he said, his voice dripping with manufactured worry. "I found your wallet in the bathroom yesterday. I did not want to say anything. But this is becoming a pattern." Miriam had predicted this with surgical precision. The relevant passage in her journal was marked with a red tab, as if she knew I would need to find it quickly. "He will start with your confidence," she wrote. "That is how parasites work. They do not attack the structure directly. They dissolve the foundation so gradually that by the time the building collapses, everyone believes it fell on its own. How do you fight an enemy who weaponizes your own age against you? Who transforms the natural imperfections of a 61-year-old memory into evidence of decay? I began watching Marcus and Jade with the same analytical focus I once applied to isolating a corrupted audio track in a multi-layered recording session. On the fifth evening, I positioned myself in the upstairs hallway, my back against the wall, my breath shallow. Below me in the guest cottage, Jade's voice carried through the thin mountain air with a clarity she clearly did not intend. She was on the phone. The name she used was Dr. Whitmore. "The timeline is accelerating," she said, her tone clinical and businesslike. "He is showing signs of confusion and disorientation. We need the cognitive assessment scheduled within the week." I could hear the faint murmur of a male voice on the other end, too distant to make out specific words, but the cadence was professional. "Rehearsed," Jade continued. "The property value alone justifies the fee structure we discussed. Once the guardianship is secured, liquidation can begin within 30 days. My fingers gripped the windowsill until the wood grain pressed white lines into my palms. This was not a son worried about his father. This was a hostile acquisition dressed in family obligation. The next morning, Reggie found me in the workshop before dawn. He carried 2 mugs of coffee and a look on his face that told me the information he held was not going to make my morning easier. He sat across from me at the workbench, the smell of brass polish and machine oil surrounding us like a familiar prayer. "I pulled the security logs from the property's internet router last night," Reggie said, sliding his phone across the bench. "Marcus has been using the guest cottage Wi-Fi for 2 weeks. Before he even arrived here, Mr. Caldwell. Before he even told you he was coming." He turned the phone to show me a series of cached search results dated 14 days before Marcus's SUV appeared at my gate. "Pinewood Recovery Center intake process. Georgia emergency guardianship filing requirements. Average timeline for temporary conservatorship approval." The searches were methodical, sequential, building toward a conclusion that Marcus had predetermined long before he hugged me on that first morning and said the mountain air suited me. I absorbed this information the way a bridge absorbs the weight of a truck it was designed to carry. Steady, distributed, controlled. But inside, the structural load was testing every weld I had. That afternoon, while Marcus was in the shower and Jade was on a call in the guest cottage, I moved through their shared space with the careful precision of a man disarming a device. His messenger bag sat open on the guest room chair. Inside, beneath a real estate magazine and a charging cable, I found a manila folder. The document inside was a pre-drafted emergency guardianship petition for the Superior Court of Buncombe County, North Carolina. My full name was typed in the respondent field. My address was listed as the cabin. The grounds cited were progressive cognitive decline and inability to manage complex financial assets. Every field was completed except one. The signature line for the evaluating physician remained empty, a blank space waiting for a name that Jade had already arranged. I photographed every page with my phone, returned the folder to its exact position, and walked out into the October cold. The morning fog was lifting from the valley below, revealing the ridgeline in sharp autumn colors that should have been beautiful but instead looked like the edge of a battlefield becoming visible as the smoke clears. Reggie was waiting for me at the workshop door, reading my expression with the fluency of a man who had spent 5 years learning Miriam's silences. He did not ask what I found. He simply placed his hand on the heavy oak frame and spoke in a voice that carried the weight of a decision already made. "It is time to open clock number 1, Mr. Caldwell. She said you would know when. And brother, this is when." I looked back at the cabin, where the sound of the shower still ran, and my son was washing off the night's calculations. Then I followed Reggie into the workshop, down the stone staircase, and into the amber silence of the vault where my wife's voice was waiting to arm me for the war her own blood had declared. The bulletproof glass of the display case reflected our faces back at us like a mirror in a confessional. Reggie stood beside me, a small velvet tool roll in his hands, his expression that of a priest preparing to unseal a sacred text. The 7 clocks sat on their individual pedestals, each one ticking at its own tempo, creating a micro-symphony that seemed to intensify in the silence of two men who understood what was about to begin. Clock number 1 occupied the leftmost position. An 1887 Black Forest cuckoo clock, hand-carved from dark walnut, its casing adorned with a scene that made my throat tighten. Wolves. 3 of them, circling a small cabin in a forest clearing, their wooden eyes catching the amber light with an almost sentient malice. Miriam had chosen this clock to begin the sequence, and now I understood why. The wolves were not decorative. They were a label. Reggie unlocked the display case with a code sequence that required both his fingerprint and a physical key. The glass panel swung open on pneumatic hinges, and the smell of aged walnut and brass mechanism oil washed over me. He lifted the clock with the reverence of a surgeon handling a transplant organ and set it on the felt-lined workbench beneath a magnifying lamp. "She showed me this once," Reggie said, his thick fingers moving with surprising delicacy along the carved base of the clock. He pressed 2 specific points on the wolf carving simultaneously, and I heard a small mechanical click from inside the casing. A hidden drawer slid out from behind the pendulum housing, no larger than a deck of cards. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, sat a matte black USB drive and a folded note in Miriam's handwriting. I unfolded the note first. Her script was steady, precise. The letters formed with the careful attention of someone who knew these words would carry legal weight. Warren. This drive contains the forensic audit of Marcus's financial activity from 2018 through 2023. His startup, Caldwell Innovations, never existed beyond a registered name and a post office box. No employees, no product, no clients. The $270,000 he raised from 3 angel investors was diverted directly into personal brokerage accounts where he lost it on leveraged margin trades. The remaining $70,000 came from credit lines secured with falsified income documentation. Total exposure, $340,000. This is not entrepreneurial failure. This is wire fraud. He has been lying to you about his career for 4 years. I am sorry you have to learn this from paper, instead of from me. But the paper cannot be manipulated the way a son's voice can. I read the note twice, then a third time. Each reading stripped away another layer of the fiction Marcus had constructed around himself. 4 years of phone calls where he described product launches and investor meetings and team-building retreats. 4 years of Christmas dinners where he spoke about quarterly projections and market positioning with the confident fluency of a man building something real. And beneath all of it, nothing. A hollow structure with an impressive facade, like a clock case with no movement inside. Reggie plugged the USB into a secure laptop he kept in the vault, one that had never been connected to any network. The files were organized with Miriam's characteristic precision. Bank statements highlighted in yellow. Wire transfer confirmations flagged in red. A timeline spreadsheet cross-referencing Marcus's claimed business activities with his actual account movements, proving that on days he told us he was in San Francisco meeting investors, he was actually in his Atlanta apartment, executing margin trades that hemorrhaged money at a rate of $12,000 per week during his worst stretches. How do you grieve a son who is still alive? How do you mourn the version of him you loved while staring at the forensic evidence of the version that actually exists? I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of the vault, the collective ticking wrapping around me like a cocoon. 1 clock opened. 6 remaining. And each one, according to Miriam's journal, contained a deeper layer of the truth. This first clock was the foundation, the financial skeleton of Marcus's fraud. The others would build upon it, constructing a case so complete that no judge could dismiss it, and no son could charm his way past it. I pulled out my phone and found the contact Miriam had listed in the back of her journal. Nathan Chen, patent attorney. But Reggie corrected me as I dialed. He is more than a patent lawyer, Mr. Caldwell, he said. Your wife retained him as a full legal strategist 18 months ago. He has been waiting for this call. Nathan answered on the second ring, his voice alert, despite the hour. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, and the fact that he knew my name without introduction told me everything about the depth of Miriam's preparation. "I have been expecting you. How many clocks have you opened?" "One," I replied. "Good. Do not open the second until I tell you. The timing has to be precise." He paused, and I heard the rustle of papers on his end. "Your wife designed this sequence like a Swiss movement, Mr. Caldwell. Every gear has to engage in the correct order or the mechanism jams. Trust the sequence." I ended the call and placed the USB drive back into the hidden compartment of clock number 1, resealing it exactly as Miriam had intended. The evidence was documented. The attorney was active. The first gear of the mechanism was now engaged. I climbed the stairs to find pale morning light leaking through the workshop windows. I had been in the vault all night. Reggie handed me a mug of coffee, and we stood in the quiet of the workshop as dawn painted the Blue Ridge in shades of cold gold. Then the cabin's front door opened, and Marcus appeared on the porch in his robe, his phone pressed to his ear, his voice carrying across the gravel with a casual confidence that made my jaw tighten. He ended his call when he saw me, sliding the phone into his pocket with a smile. "Dad, good news. I arranged for a specialist to come by tomorrow. Just a quick cognitive screening. Nothing invasive. Dr. Whitmore comes highly recommended for men your age." He said it the way someone orders breakfast. Light, inconsequential, routine. But I heard the winding key turning. I heard the spring tightening, and I knew that within 72 hours, the petition in his messenger bag would have its missing signature, and the cage he was building would be ready to close. 72 hours. That is how long it takes to erase a man's legal existence in the state of Georgia. It is also exactly how long Miriam calculated I would need to open clocks 2 through 4. Dr. Leonard Whitmore arrived at 11 the next morning, in a silver BMW that looked more expensive than the medical services it delivered. He stepped out carrying a leather portfolio embossed with a logo I did not recognize, and wearing a smile so precisely calibrated that it reminded me of a clock hand positioned to the exact second. His handshake was clinical. 2 pumps and release. His fingers cold and dry against my palm. He smelled of antiseptic cologne, and the particular leather scent of seats that cost more than my first car. Marcus greeted him at the door like an old colleague, which told me everything about how long this arrangement had been in negotiation. The 2 men exchanged a look of shared purpose that lasted less than a second, but registered in my trained ears like a frequency spike on a waveform. They had rehearsed this. We sat in the cabin's living room, the morning light streaming through the windows and illuminating the dust motes that floated between us like tiny witnesses. Whitmore opened his portfolio and produced a series of printed forms, his movements possessing the practiced efficiency of a man who had conducted this particular performance many times before. "Mr. Caldwell, this is simply a baseline cognitive screening," he began, his voice possessing a flat, rehearsed warmth. "Nothing invasive. Just a conversation to ensure you are managing well after your loss." I noticed immediately that his portfolio bore a small embossed seal in the corner. Ridgeline Development Partners. The same firm Marcus had mentioned during our dinner confrontation. This was not a physician making a house call. This was a paid consultant, wearing a stethoscope as a costume. Before we began, I excused myself to the bathroom. In the hallway, I pressed the recording application on my phone, slid the device into my breast pocket with the microphone positioned toward the collar opening, and returned to my seat with the same measured calm I had maintained throughout decades of high-pressure studio sessions where a single misplaced hand could ruin a $100,000 recording. Whitmore began with rapid-fire cognitive questions. Date, location, the current president, the sequence of months backward. I answered each one with precision, watching his pen move across the page, in notations that I suspected had nothing to do with my actual responses. He asked me to recall a series of 5 words, after a delay. I gave him all 5 without hesitation. He asked me to draw a clock face with the hands at 10 past 11. I drew it perfectly, adding the second hand for emphasis. Then the questions shifted. Tell me about your wife's collection, Mr. Caldwell. Do you find yourself spending excessive time alone with these objects? He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing with a manufactured clinical interest. Would you say your attachment to this property is proportional to its practical value in your life? I recognized the trap. Every answer I gave about the collection's importance would be reframed as fixation. Every expression of emotional connection to Miriam's work would become pathological attachment in his report. He was not measuring my cognition. He was mining for ammunition. I have spent 40 years working with sound, Doctor, I replied, keeping my voice level and clear for the recording. I understand the difference between signal and noise. This collection is a signal. Your questions are the noise. Whitmore did not react. He simply made another notation, the scratch of his pen sounding like an insect burrowing into wood. Marcus sat in the corner, his arms crossed, watching the proceedings with the quiet satisfaction of a man whose order has arrived exactly as specified. Have you ever been evaluated by someone whose conclusion was written before you entered the room? There is a specific helplessness in performing competence for an audience that has already decided you are broken. It is the sound of speaking into a microphone that has already been disconnected from the mixing board. The assessment lasted 43 minutes. Whitmore closed his portfolio with a definitive snap and stood, brushing invisible lint from his sleeve. He shook my hand again, that same cold, dry grip, and offered a smile that never reached the calculating machinery behind his eyes. Thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell. I will have my findings compiled within 48 hours. I walked him to the door, maintaining the posture of a cooperative patient who suspects nothing. But as he stepped onto the porch, I positioned myself near the open kitchen window that faced the driveway. Marcus followed Whitmore to the BMW, and their voices carried through the October air with a clarity they clearly did not anticipate. The screening supports the petition, Whitmore said, pulling his car door open. Classic fixation patterns, emotional dysregulation masked as intellectual engagement. I can have the recommendation signed by Friday. And Pinewood? Marcus asked, his voice dropping to a frequency that vibrated with barely contained eagerness. Whitmore paused, one foot in the car. Pinewood can process intake within 72 hours of a signed judicial order. I have an arrangement with their admissions director. Once the judge signs, transport is same day. Same day. The words hit my nervous system like a voltage spike. They were not planning weeks of deliberation or gradual persuasion. They were planning a surgical extraction. One signed paper, one phone call, and I would be removed from my own property before I could reach Nathan Chen's number. I stood at the kitchen window long after the BMW disappeared down the mountain road, the recording app still running in my breast pocket. 43 minutes of documentation now preserved in digital amber. Then I called Nathan. He answered immediately, as if his phone had been in his hand. How did it go? He asked, his voice sharp with focus. Whitmore is filing by Friday. Pinewood intake within 72 hours of the judge's signature. They want same-day transport. Nathan was silent for 3 seconds. When he spoke again, his voice carried the cold precision of a man executing a plan that had been calibrated years in advance. Then we open clocks 2, 3, and 4 tonight. Your wife calculated 72 hours would be enough, Mr. Caldwell. She was never wrong about the timing of a mechanism. I ended the call and looked at the clock on the cabin wall. Its second hand swept in its endless circle, each tick marking one less moment before the cage either closed around me or collapsed around the men who built it. The countdown was no longer theoretical. It was mechanical, precise, and already in motion. We waited until 1 in the morning. The cabin above us was dark. Marcus and Jade retired to the guest cottage hours ago, their bedroom light extinguishing at 11:15 according to Reggie's security feed. The mountain held its breath around us as we descended into the vault, the stone staircase cold beneath my boots, the amber light below rising to meet us like the glow of a furnace preparing to forge something irreversible. Reggie moved with the efficiency of a man operating under orders that predated my arrival. He unlocked the bulletproof case and lifted clock number 2 from its pedestal. A Swiss pocket watch from 1889. Its silver case engraved with an alpine scene, so fine the details required magnification to appreciate. He pressed a hidden catch on the crown mechanism, and the case back opened to reveal not a movement, but a sealed compartment, no larger than a postage stamp. Inside sat a micro SD card, wrapped in a slip of Miriam's paper. "This one cuts deeper, Warren," she had written. "He used your name. I am sorry." The card contained a single PDF. An email chain between Marcus and a private lender in Atlanta, dated 11 months ago. Marcus had offered the Blue Ridge property as collateral for a $200,000 emergency loan. The lender's response asked for proof of ownership or authorized representative status. Marcus's reply included a scanned document, a letter of authorization granting him power to negotiate on behalf of his father, Warren Caldwell, regarding all properties held in family trust. My signature was at the bottom, except I had never signed it. I had never seen it. The loops were close to mine, but lacked the specific pressure points that 40 years of gripping audio faders had worn into my writing hand. My son had forged my signature to leverage my dead wife's property against his gambling debts. He had turned my name into a skeleton key for his own destruction. How do you describe the sound of trust breaking? It is not a crack or a snap. It is a frequency that simply vanishes from the spectrum, leaving behind a silence so absolute that you realize you had been hearing it your entire life without knowing its name. Reggie was already lifting clock number 3, a 1923 Art Deco mantel clock with geometric jade inlays that caught the amber light like frozen pieces of a forest. The hidden compartment in this one was concealed behind a removable jade panel on the base, secured with a magnetic latch that Reggie released with a small tool from his kit. This clock held an audio file. Reggie connected a small Bluetooth speaker to the vault laptop, and Miriam's voice did not play. Instead, Marcus's voice filled the underground chamber, recorded from what sounded like a phone call on speaker. The audio quality suggested it was captured by a device hidden in proximity, perhaps in a bag or coat pocket in the same room. Marcus spoke first, his tone relaxed and transactional. "Once the old man is committed, we liquidate within 30 days. The property alone is worth 2.4 without the collection. With the collection appraised and sold piecemeal, we are looking at 14, maybe 15 million total." Jade's voice responded, equally clinical. "And the timeline for the conservatorship filing? We need the diagnosis first. Once Whitmore signs off, the emergency petition goes to a judge within a week. The old man will be in Pinewood before he knows what happened." I checked the metadata on the file. Recorded 8 months before Miriam's stroke. 8 months. Marcus had been planning this while his mother was still alive. While she was still cooking Sunday dinners and writing him birthday cards and quietly dying from a tumor he never bothered to notice. He had been measuring the dimensions of my cage while she was measuring the remaining days of her life. The third clock was not just evidence. It was proof of premeditation that predated Miriam's death. Reggie's hands were steady as he reached for clock number 4. But I noticed a tension in his jaw that had not been there before. The 1911 German anniversary clock was elegant, its rotating pendulum spinning in its glass dome with hypnotic precision. The hidden compartment was built into the base, accessible by removing 4 specific screws in a pattern that Reggie clearly knew from memory. This clock contained a corporate filing. Jade Kim was not Marcus's girlfriend. She was a registered employee of Ridgeline Development Partners, the same firm whose logo appeared on Whitmore's portfolio. Her title was Senior Acquisitions Coordinator. Her employment start date was 14 months ago, 3 months before she appeared in Marcus's life as his romantic partner. The filing also showed that Ridgeline had placed a pre-offer on the Blue Ridge property through a shell company 7 months ago, contingent on the current owner being declared legally incapacitated. Marcus and Jade were not lovers. They were business partners executing a corporate land grab, and the intimacy was theater designed to give Jade proximity to the target without raising suspicion. I sat on the stool. 4 clocks now open. Their secrets extracted and documented on the vault laptop. The weight of the evidence was staggering. Wire fraud, forgery, premeditated elder abuse, corporate conspiracy. And at the center of it all, my son, a man I had held as an infant, a man whose first word I had recorded on a reel-to-reel tape machine that still sat in my Savannah studio. Then a sound from above froze us both. Footsteps on the workshop floor. Heavy, deliberate, moving toward the vault staircase. Reggie killed the laptop screen and we stood in darkness. The only light, the soft amber glow of the display cases, and the only sound, the collective breathing of 200 clocks. The vault door handle turned. Then a knock, hollow, metallic, echoing down the stone stairwell. "Dad?" Marcus's voice drifted down, sleepy and suspicious. "Why are you in the basement at 3 in the morning?" I could hear him shifting his weight on the other side of the steel door, testing whether it would open. This is exactly the kind of behavior Dr. Whitmore was concerned about. I stood in the amber dark. 4 clocks worth of evidence glowing on a screen I had just extinguished, and realized that my son was not just building a case against my sanity. He was witnessing it in real time. And every moment I spent down here in the early hours would become another line in Whitmore's recommendation, another brick in my cage. The handle stopped turning. His footsteps retreated up the stairs. But the silence he left behind was not relief. It was the sound of a clock spring winding one turn tighter toward the moment it would either release its energy or snap entirely. The courthouse smelled of floor wax and wet wool, a combination that reminded me of the waiting rooms I had sat in as a child, while my father handled the bureaucratic machinery of an adult world I could not yet comprehend. Now I was 61, and the machinery was being used to dismantle me. The Buncombe County Superior Courthouse was a stone building with high ceilings that amplified every footstep into an accusation. I sat at the respondent's table in courtroom 3, my hands flat on the cold oak surface, feeling the vibration of the heating system rumbling through the wood like a low-frequency warning. Marcus sat across the aisle in a navy suit I had never seen before, his posture erect with the manufactured solemnity of a man performing grief for an audience. Jade was absent. Her role required invisibility now that the legal machinery was in motion. Dr. Whitmore took the stand with the fluid ease of a man who had testified in these proceedings dozens of times, his voice adopting a clinical authority that transformed opinion into apparent fact. Mr. Caldwell exhibits a pattern of cognitive fixation consistent with early-stage hoarding disorder, compounded by complicated grief, Whitmore stated, his eyes fixed on the judge rather than me. His nocturnal behavior, specifically his documented presence in a basement vault at 3 in the morning, suggests a dissociative attachment to material objects that has superseded his capacity for rational self-governance. 3 in the morning. Marcus had turned that single moment into the cornerstone of a medical opinion. One night in my own vault, in my own property, examining my own wife's legacy, and it had become the clinical evidence of my incompetence. My court-appointed attorney, a young woman with kind eyes and an overwhelming caseload, raised an objection that was sustained but ultimately meaningless against the weight of Whitmore's credentials and Marcus's tearful testimony. "Your Honor, my father is a brilliant man," Marcus said, his voice cracking with a precision that made my stomach turn. "But since Mom's death, he has become obsessed with her collection to the exclusion of his own health and safety. I am terrified of losing him the way we lost her. Have you ever watched your own child perform your destruction with the skill of a seasoned actor and felt the simultaneous impulse to applaud the craft and weep for the soul that made it possible?" The judge, a man named Morrison with silver hair and a face that suggested he had processed 10,000 similar petitions without remembering a single respondent's name, reviewed Whitmore's report for less than 4 minutes. He granted the emergency temporary conservatorship with a 30-day review period and ordered immediate placement at Pinewood Recovery Center for observation and stabilization. I did not fight the bailiffs who approached me. I did not raise my voice or resist the gentle but firm hands that guided me from the courtroom. Miriam's words echoed in my mind with a clarity that cut through the noise of the moment. The cage is temporary. Nathan knows the timeline. Reggie knows the clocks. Your job inside is simple. Survive, observe, and remember everything. The transport van smelled of industrial disinfectant and diesel exhaust. The metal bench was cold through my trousers, and the small barred window offered a shrinking view of the Blue Ridge Mountains as we descended into the valley. I pressed my palm against the glass, feeling the vibration of the road beneath us, and silently counted the seconds between each pothole. An old habit. Sound engineers measure everything, even the distance between impacts. Pinewood Recovery Center revealed itself at the end of a manicured drive lined with ornamental cherry trees that would not bloom for another 5 months. The building was designed to look like a luxury resort. All river stone and cedar with floor-to-ceiling windows that faced a landscaped courtyard. But I noticed the details that contradicted the aesthetic. Magnetic locks on every door. Cameras positioned at 15-degree angles to eliminate blind spots. Windows that opened only 4 inches before a steel stop engaged. A beautiful cage is still a cage. The only difference is the quality of the bars. Intake was a systematic erasure of identity. My belt was confiscated. My shoelaces removed. My phone, my watch, and the brass key that had started everything were sealed in a plastic bag and locked in a cabinet behind the reception desk. The intake clerk smiled with rehearsed warmth as she cataloged my possessions. "We would not want you losing track of time, Mr. Caldwell," she said, her pen scratching against the inventory form. "I do not need a watch to know exactly how long a lie can survive in a place like this," I replied, and watched her smile falter for a fraction of a second before it reset itself. They assigned me to room 112. Beige walls, fluorescent ceiling panels, a bed with sheets so thin I could feel the mattress springs through the fabric like a topographical map of discomfort. My roommate was an elderly man who shuffled in circles and muttered fragments of legal terminology that no one but me seemed to recognize as actual case citations. I listened to him for an hour, before the horrifying realization settled in my chest. He was a former attorney, trapped here through a scheme so similar to my own that the coincidence felt less like chance and more like an industry. How many men in this building are prisoners of their own families? How many of these rooms contain minds that are sharp enough to know they have been erased, but powerless to prove it to anyone who matters? The first evening rounds brought a woman named Ruth. She moved through the room with a quiet competence that distinguished her immediately from the other staff, whose interactions felt scripted and hollow. She checked my vitals with genuine attention, her tired eyes meeting mine without the patronizing simplification the others employed. She noted where my gaze drifted, toward the door hinges, the window latch, the fire exit sign at the end of the corridor. "You are checking the structural integrity of this building, Mr. Caldwell," she said softly, adjusting my blood pressure cuff. "Most residents here are not aware enough to notice the doors have hinges." "Force of habit," I replied. "Sound studios, recording booths, concert halls. Everything has weak points if you know how to listen for them." She leaned in to adjust my pillow, her lips close enough to my ear that her whisper was inaudible to the camera mounted in the corner. Her words carried the weight of something she had been holding for a very long time. "Your wife was my patient at the Emory Oncology Ward 3 years ago. She told me you would come here eventually. She asked me to give you this when you did." Ruth's hand pressed a small folded paper into my palm, with the sleight of a woman who had practiced this transfer many times in her mind. Then she straightened, returned to her professional posture, and continued her rounds as if nothing had passed between us. I waited until the lights dimmed for the night cycle before unfolding the paper beneath my thin sheets. 6 words in Miriam's handwriting, the ink slightly faded but the message absolute. "Clock 5 is already in motion." I pressed the paper against my chest and stared at the ceiling. The fluorescent lights hummed at 60 hertz, a frequency I had spent my career trying to eliminate from recordings. But tonight, it sounded different. Tonight, it sounded like a countdown that someone else was running on my behalf. The cage was real, but the mechanism outside it was still ticking, and Miriam's hand was still on the winding key. By the fifth day in Pinewood, I had mapped the entire facility, the way I once mapped the acoustic signature of a recording studio. Every room had its frequency. The dining hall hummed at a low 70 hertz from the industrial refrigeration units behind the kitchen wall. The recreation room buzzed with the particular electromagnetic whine of a television that was never turned off. The corridors carried a constant 60 hertz drone from the fluorescent fixtures overhead, a frequency that burrowed into the skull, like a persistent thought that refused to resolve. But it was the silences between the sounds that told me the most. In the gaps between medication rounds and meal announcements, I listened to the other residents, not the incoherent ones whose minds had genuinely surrendered to time, the sharp ones, the ones whose eyes tracked the orderlies with the same calculated awareness mine did. I found 3 of them within the first week. Harold, a 72-year-old retired accountant whose nephew had filed an identical petition 18 months ago after Harold refused to co-sign a business loan. Margaret, 68, former real estate broker, committed by her stepchildren after she threatened to change her will. And David, 75, a former professor of law whose detailed recitation of habeas corpus precedents was dismissed by staff as symptomatic rambling. All 3 had been evaluated by Dr. Whitmore. All 3 had been placed at Pinewood through emergency petitions. All 3 were paying residents whose insurance policies or family assets funded their indefinite stays at rates that made my stomach turn. Pinewood was not a recovery center. It was a revenue stream, and Whitmore was the pipeline feeding it. Ruth became my conduit to the outside world. She worked the night shift 3 times a week, and during her rounds, she would pause at my bedside with the practiced casualness of a nurse checking vitals, her whispered updates arriving between blood pressure readings and temperature checks. On day 7, she confirmed that Reggie had received the signal from Nathan and that operations were proceeding on schedule. On day 9, she brought the first real intelligence. She leaned in during a routine pillow adjustment, her voice barely a vibration against my ear. Clock 5 opened yesterday. Nathan says the poison pill is confirmed and documented. If they try to sell, the property transfers to a charitable trust automatically. They cannot liquidate without your verified consent. I absorbed this information with the same controlled stillness I had maintained for 9 days. Clock number 5. The 1935 French carriage clock, with its beveled glass panels, had contained Miriam's legal failsafe, a clause buried so deep in the corporate structure of the property trust that no standard real estate attorney would find it without knowing exactly where to look. If the property was sold without my express consent, verified by 2 independent witnesses and a notary public, the entire estate would transfer irrevocably to the Appalachian Horological Preservation Society. Marcus could file every petition in the state. He could have me declared incompetent by every doctor in Georgia. But he could not sell what Miriam had designed to self-destruct in the hands of a thief. How do you build a lock that even a legal key cannot open? You build it with love, and you hide the blueprints inside a clock that only the right hands can wind. 3 days later, Ruth delivered the second update. Her voice was tighter this time, carrying an urgency that made the hair on my arms rise. Clock 6, she whispered. Video evidence. Nathan says it is devastating. Clock number 6. The 1948 American Railroad clock with its heavy brass dial, built for the precision demanded by train schedules, where a second's deviation could mean collision. Reggie had opened it and found what Miriam had placed inside for exactly this moment. A USB drive containing a screen recording of a Zoom call between Marcus and Dr. Whitmore, captured by spyware Miriam had installed on Marcus's laptop during her last visit to his Atlanta apartment. The video showed both men on camera, discussing what Whitmore called the fee structure for the Caldwell case. $30,000 for the diagnosis, $15,000 for the court testimony, and a monthly kickback of 8% of my Pinewood billing for as long as I remained institutionalized. They had put a price on my disappearance, and Miriam had recorded the receipt. Ruth told me that Nathan had compiled the evidence from both clocks into a formal dossier and filed an emergency motion to vacate the conservatorship. He had also submitted Clock 6's video to the Georgia Medical Board as evidence of fraud. But his final move was the one that made me understand why Miriam had chosen him. Nathan sent a single encrypted email directly to Marcus's personal account. No legal jargon, no threats, just one line. Your mother left more than clocks, Marcus. She left a detonation sequence. Clock 7 is next. Ruth described what happened afterward based on Reggie's security feed from the cabin. Marcus received the email at 9:17 in the evening. By 9:19, he was on his feet, pacing the guest cottage with his phone pressed to his ear. By 9:23, he was screaming. The cabin cameras captured audio through the thin walls, his voice cracking with a hysteria that bore no resemblance to the composed predator who had smiled at me across courtroom 3. How the hell did she know? His voice carried across the security feed in jagged fragments. She was dying. She was supposed to be too sick to notice anything. How did she know about Whitmore? How did she know about Ridgeline? Jade's response was clinical, devoid of the panic infecting Marcus. Her voice cut through his noise with the flat precision of a woman whose loyalty was transactional. We need to accelerate, she said. File the sale papers tonight. Force the liquidation before they get to Clock 7. If that clock opens in a courtroom, we are both finished. I lay in my bed at Pinewood, staring at the 60-hertz ceiling, and felt something I had not felt since the bailiffs led me from the courtroom. Power. Not the loud, explosive kind. The quiet, mechanical kind. The kind that builds behind a mainspring for years, invisible and patient, until the escapement releases and the stored energy moves through every gear in the system simultaneously. 6 clocks open. 1 remaining. And Marcus was finally hearing the sound that Miriam had been composing in silence for 7 years. The sound of his own destruction, ticking steadily toward midnight. The visiting room at Pinewood was designed to feel like a living room in a magazine that no one actually lived in. Neutral cushions, artificial plants. A window that overlooked the courtyard where residents walked in slow, prescribed circles like satellites in decaying orbits. The air smelled of fabric softener and the faint chemical sweetness of air freshener working overtime to mask the institutional truth beneath. I sat in the designated visitor's chair, my back straight, my hands resting on the armrests with the deliberate calm of a man who knows the camera in the upper corner is recording every micro-expression. Marcus appeared at the door at 2:15, escorted by an orderly who lingered near the threshold with the casual attention of someone trained to monitor without appearing to watch. My son had aged in the 3 weeks since the courtroom. The charcoal blazer was gone, replaced by a rumpled button-down that looked like it had been pulled from a suitcase rather than a closet. His eyes carried the specific exhaustion of a man who has been sleeping beside his own destruction without knowing when it would detonate. He sat across from me and placed a thin folder on the table between us. His fingers trembled almost imperceptibly against the paper, a frequency of distress that my trained ears translated into the visible spectrum without effort. "Dad," he began, his voice adopting the same manufactured warmth that Dr. Whitmore had used during the assessment. "I need you to understand that I am trying to help. This situation, you being here, it is killing me." He pushed the folder toward me with a gesture meant to look casual but telegraphed desperation. "I brought some paperwork that could simplify things. A limited power of attorney, just for the property maintenance costs while you are stabilizing. Nothing permanent." I did not touch the folder. I looked at my son the way I once looked at a waveform that contained a hidden distortion, searching for the exact frequency where the corruption lived. "Marcus," I said, my voice quiet and even, "do you remember what your mother used to say about clocks?" He blinked. The question clearly did not belong to the script he had rehearsed on the drive here. "She said a lot of things about clocks, Dad." He forced a smile. "She was obsessed with them. She said that every mechanism tells the truth about its maker." I continued, keeping my gaze fixed on his. The quality of the gears, the tension of the springs, the precision of the escapement. "You cannot lie inside a clock, Marcus. The mechanism always reveals the hand that wounded it." His smile faltered. A flicker of something cold moved behind his eyes, the same calculation I had watched sharpen over the past weeks. Dad, this is exactly what I am talking about. You are fixating. Can we please just focus on the paperwork? His hand pressed the folder closer, his knuckles whitening against the beige surface. I leaned forward. My voice dropped to a frequency I knew the room camera would still capture, but that felt intimate enough to bypass his defenses. I know about the letter of authorization you sent to the Atlanta lender, Marcus. The one with my forged signature, offering the Blue Ridge property as collateral for $200,000. The color drained from his face in real time, a visible tide receding to expose the barren shoreline beneath. I know about the phone call you recorded 8 months before your mother died, I continued. Each word placed with the precision of a note in a scored composition. The one where you told Jade that once the old man is committed, you liquidate within 30 days. Marcus stood up so abruptly that his chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream compressed into a single frequency. His composure shattered in stages, the smooth exterior splintering to reveal the jagged architecture of panic underneath. His voice dropped to a hiss. She told you. She put it in those clocks. That is what they are. Are they not? Evidence. She was building a case against me while she was dying. I remained seated, my hands still on the armrests, my heartbeat steady. She was building a fortress, Marcus. You just happened to be the threat it was designed against. How do you watch your own son unravel and feel both sorrow and justice in the same breath? It is a frequency I hope no other father ever has to hear. His pacing accelerated. He ran his hands through his hair, pulling at the roots in a gesture that looked less like frustration and more like a man trying to physically extract the reality he was finally being forced to confront. Then the dam broke. His voice rose to a volume that made the orderly at the door step forward. She was supposed to just die, Dad. His words came out raw, stripped of every performance he had ever constructed. She was supposed to die and leave everything to you, and you were supposed to be too old and too sad to do anything but hand it over. That was the plan. That was always the plan. She was not supposed to fight back from the grave. The room went still. The air freshener cycled. The camera in the corner recorded. And my son stood in the center of the visiting room, his confession hanging in the manufactured air like smoke after a detonation. She was supposed to just die. 6 words that confirmed every line Miriam had written in her journal. 6 words that revealed my son had not merely planned to steal from me. He had counted on his mother's death as the enabling event, the starting gun for his scheme. He had not mourned her. He had waited for her. The orderly moved in with professional efficiency, his hand on Marcus's elbow, guiding him toward the door with a firmness that was no longer optional. Sir, visiting hours are concluding. Please come with me. Marcus wrenched his arm free and turned back to me one final time. His eyes were wet, but not with remorse. With the specific fury of a man who has just realized the trap was set before he was even born. You think you have won, old man? He spat, his voice carrying the metallic edge of absolute desperation. You think some clocks and a dead woman's diary can save you? I stood slowly, feeling the full height of my frame for the first time in 3 weeks. My voice was calm, low, and meant for the camera as much as for him. Clock 7 is waiting for you, son, and this time, it will not be ticking. Security escorted him out. The door closed with the soft magnetic click that I had grown accustomed to hearing as the sound of confinement. But for the first time since arriving at Pinewood, it sounded like something else, entirely. It sounded like the closing of a chapter that had been written in my wife's hand long before the first page was turned. I sat back down in the visitor's chair and waited for the orderly to return me to my room. The camera had captured everything. Marcus's confession, his outburst, his admission that his mother was supposed to die on schedule. And somewhere in Atlanta, Nathan Chen's phone was already ringing with the notification that the Pinewood security office had flagged a visitor incident in room 4. Another gear engaged. Another spring released. The mechanism was approaching its final revolution. I walked into courtroom 3 wearing the same suit I had worn the day they took me to Pinewood. It had been dry cleaned and pressed by someone at Nathan's office, the fabric carrying the faint chemical scent of professional care rather than the institutional lemon of the last 3 weeks. The courthouse felt different this time, not because the stone walls had changed or the floor wax smelled less oppressive, but because I was no longer the man being processed by the machinery. I was the man who had come to dismantle it. Nathan Chen sat at the defense table with the controlled energy of a conductor about to bring an orchestra to its crescendo. His briefcase was open, its contents arranged with a precision that reminded me of Miriam's vault. Beside him sat a portable evidence case, matte black, containing the 7 clocks that had traveled from the Blue Ridge under armed escort that morning. Marcus occupied the opposite table, flanked by a new attorney whose posture suggested he had only recently been briefed on the depth of the situation. Jade was absent again. I would learn later that she had attempted to board a flight to Vancouver the previous evening and had been intercepted by federal agents at Charlotte Douglas International. Her seat remained empty in the gallery like a missing tooth. Judge Patterson, who had replaced Morrison after Nathan's conflict of interest filing, was a woman with sharp eyes and silver-streaked hair, pulled back in a manner that suggested she valued efficiency above ceremony. She reviewed the emergency motion on her bench, then looked up at Nathan with an expression that communicated a single message. "Make it count." Nathan stood. "Your Honor, we are not here to discuss a man's memory. We are here to present evidence of a premeditated criminal conspiracy to defraud, falsely imprison, and financially exploit a competent adult through the weaponization of this court's own guardianship statutes." He began with clock number 1. The forensic audit appeared on the courtroom display, columns of transactions and phantom business registrations scrolling in damning sequence. Nathan narrated each discovery with the clinical precision of a surgeon describing an autopsy. No startup, no employees, no revenue. $340,000 diverted into personal gambling accounts. Clock 2 followed. The forged signature enlarged on the screen, beside a certified analysis from a forensic handwriting expert who confirmed with 97% certainty that the letter of authorization was not written by Warren Caldwell. Clock 3 filled the courtroom with Marcus's own voice. The audio recording played through the speakers with devastating clarity. "Once the old man is committed, we liquidate within 30 days. I watched Marcus sink lower in his chair as his own words echoed off the judicial wood. Clock 4 introduced Jade Kim's corporate filing. Senior Acquisitions Coordinator for Ridgeline Development Partners. Employment date, predating her appearance as Marcus's romantic partner by 3 months. The pre-offer on the property contingent on owner incapacitation. Nathan then called Ruth to the stand. She walked to the witness box with the steady gait of a woman who had waited 3 years for this moment. She testified about Pinewood's financial arrangement with Dr. Whitmore, the kickback structure, the 3 other residents she had identified as illegitimate placements through identical schemes. Her voice did not waver. Her eyes found mine once, briefly. And I saw in them the fulfillment of a promise made to a dying woman in an oncology ward. Clock 5's poison pill clause was entered as evidence of Miriam's awareness of the threat and her legal preparations against it. Clock 6's video played on the display. Whitmore and Marcus on a Zoom call, the fee structure laid bare in their own words. $30,000 for diagnosis, $15,000 for testimony. 8% monthly. The courtroom had grown progressively quieter with each revelation. The gallery spectators leaning forward as if drawn by the gravitational pull of accumulating truth. But it was clock 7 that silenced even the scratching of the court reporter's pen. Nathan lifted the 1742 English long case clock from the evidence case with the assistance of a court officer. Its dark face had witnessed nearly 3 centuries of human behavior, and now it would witness one more act of judgment. Nathan opened the hidden compartment in the base, a mechanism he had been trained to access by Reggie via secure video call the night before. 3 items emerged. The first was a USB drive containing a phone recording of Marcus speaking with a debt enforcement agent, promising full repayment upon the successful liquidation of his father's estate. The timestamp predated Miriam's death by 5 months. premeditated elder abuse, documented in the perpetrator's own voice. The second was a forensic accountant's report, commissioned and paid for by Miriam, proving conclusively that Marcus's startup had never conducted a single legitimate business transaction. The report met federal evidentiary standards for wire fraud prosecution. The third was a letter, sealed in acid-free paper, written in Miriam's steady hand, addressed to the presiding judge of any court proceeding involving the guardianship of Warren Caldwell. Nathan read it aloud. "My name is Miriam Caldwell. I am a horologist, a mother, and a woman who is dying. By the time this letter reaches a courtroom, I will no longer be able to speak, but I can still testify. My son, Marcus Caldwell, is a predator. He has spent years building a mechanism designed to imprison his father and liquidate the legacy I built to protect him. Every clock in my collection was a word I could not say aloud. Every gear was a piece of evidence I could not present while I was alive. I am asking this court to hear my voice through the mechanisms I leave behind. Protect my husband. He is the finest structure I have ever known. Do not let my son dismantle him." The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was a frequency unto itself, a resonance that filled the courtroom with the weight of a dead woman's love and the precision of her final engineering project. Judge Patterson removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench. She looked at Marcus, then at Whitmore's empty chair, then at the 7 clocks, arranged on the evidence table, like witnesses who had waited 3 centuries to speak. "The conservatorship is dissolved immediately, and with prejudice," she announced, her voice carrying the weight of institutional correction. "Mr. Marcus Caldwell, you are remanded into federal custody pending charges of wire fraud, forgery, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit false imprisonment." The bailiffs moved with swift efficiency. Marcus stood as the handcuffs closed around his wrists, his face a gray mask of something that existed beyond shock, in a territory where the architecture of a man's self-deception finally encounters the bedrock of consequence. He turned to look at me one final time as they led him toward the holding door. "You think you won, old man? You lost a son today." I met his eyes across the distance of the courtroom, across the distance of 36 years of fatherhood and 6 years of betrayal, and I gave him the only truth I had left. "I lost my son years ago, Marcus. Today I just buried what was left." The gavel struck. The sound was not the beginning of something. It was the final tick of a mechanism that had been running for 7 years. Its mainspring finally unwound, its purpose fulfilled, its maker's hand reaching across death itself to deliver the precision she had always been known for. The courthouse doors opened onto a November afternoon so bright it felt like a contradiction. The sun sat low over the ridgeline, turning the wet stone steps into a surface of fractured gold, and the air carried the clean mineral bite of a mountain winter approaching without apology. I stood on the top step and breathed, not the measured, controlled breathing of a man conserving energy inside a cage. The full, unrestricted expansion of lungs that belonged to no institution and no schedule and no one's authority but my own. Behind me, through the heavy doors, I could hear the procedural machinery continuing to grind. Nathan had informed me during a brief corridor conversation that Marcus's federal charges carried a combined maximum of 22 years. The plea negotiation, if Marcus was smart enough to take it, would likely result in 14. Wire fraud, forgery, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit false imprisonment, each charge a gear and a mechanism that would keep my son behind reinforced walls for longer than his scheme had taken to construct. Dr. Leonard Whitmore did not fare better. Federal marshals intercepted him at his practice in Asheville before the courthouse clock struck 4. The Georgia Medical Board had already initiated emergency revocation proceedings based on Clock 6's video evidence. Nathan told me that Whitmore's attorney attempted to negotiate a voluntary surrender of his license in exchange for dropped criminal charges. The prosecution declined. 3 other families deserved their day in court. I thought of Harold, Margaret, and David, 3 strangers who had become my silent companions in the fluorescent corridors of Pinewood. Nathan had filed emergency motions on their behalf that morning, citing the systemic fraud that Whitmore's arrest had exposed. By the end of the week, all three would be released. Harold's nephew would face his own investigation. Margaret's stepchildren would learn that inheritance is not a right, but a privilege that can be revoked by conscience. And David, the former law professor whose habeas corpus recitations had been dismissed as symptoms, would finally be heard by a system that should have listened years ago. Justice does not arrive with the speed of sound. It arrives with the patience of a well-wound mainspring, releasing its energy in precise increments until the hands reach the hour they were always meant to indicate. Jade Kim's arrest had been confirmed by Nathan's office during the proceedings. She was detained at Charlotte Douglas International with a one-way ticket to Vancouver and a laptop containing correspondence with Ridgeline Development Partners that would add corporate conspiracy charges to her file. The woman who had measured my property with the eyes of an acquisitions specialist would now have years to contemplate the difference between an asset and a life. I descended the courthouse steps alone. Nathan had offered to drive me, but I needed the solitude of the road the way a musician needs silence between movements. My rental car sat in the lot where I had left it 3 weeks ago. A parking ticket faded to illegibility beneath the wiper blade. I slid behind the wheel and sat for a long moment, my hands resting on the cold leather, feeling the absence of the brass key that had started everything. It was still in evidence, sealed in a plastic bag in the courthouse archives. But I no longer needed it. The doors it was meant to open had already swung wide. The drive back to Blue Ridge took 2 hours. The highway curved through valleys that were shedding the last of their autumn color, the bare branches of oak and maple creating a lattice against the gray sky that looked like the internal framework of a clock stripped of its decorative case. I drove in silence. No radio, no podcast, just the hum of the engine and the rhythmic whisper of tires against cold asphalt. My mind was not empty. It was processing, reorganizing the frequencies of my life into a new arrangement that no longer included the constant background noise of threat. When the granite road appeared and the cabin materialized through the bare trees, I felt a physical release in my chest that I had not realized I was holding. 3 weeks of controlled breathing, of measured responses, of performing sanity for cameras and orderlies, and a system designed to doubt me. All of it exhaled in a single long breath as I turned off the engine and sat in the silence of my own property. Reggie appeared on the workshop porch before I opened the car door. He did not rush. He walked toward me with the measured pace of a man who had been maintaining his position for 3 weeks without wavering. His face weathered but steady, his eyes reflecting something that looked like the particular satisfaction of a mission completed according to specifications. He did not embrace me. He extended his hand, and I shook it, feeling the callous strength of a craftsman's grip and the slight tremor of emotion he was working to control. "Welcome home, Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice carrying the gravel of suppressed feeling. "The vines are dormant, the workshop is secure, and every clock is still running." We walked together to the vault. The descent felt different now. Not a journey into secrecy, but a return to something sacred. The amber lights rose to greet us, and the collective ticking of 200 mechanisms filled the underground space with their familiar orchestral pulse. But the sound had changed. 3 weeks ago, it had been a countdown, a mechanism racing toward a detonation point. Now, it was simply time. Unweighted, unpressured, belonging to no scheme and no deadline, and no one's calendar but mine. I walked along the rows, my fingertips brushing the glass cases, feeling the faint vibration of each movement through the surface. Every clock still running, every mechanism faithful, every word Miriam had placed inside them, delivered with the precision she had spent her life perfecting. The 7 display pedestals in the bulletproof case were empty now, their velvet surfaces bearing the faint impressions of the clocks that had traveled to court and would remain in evidence for the duration of the trial. 7 empty spaces where 7 voices had once waited in patient silence. They had spoken. Their testimony was finished. I turned to leave the vault, but Reggie cleared his throat. The sound was soft, almost apologetic, and it stopped me at the base of the stairs. He reached into his jacket and produced a cream envelope, slightly worn at the edges, bearing Miriam's handwriting on the front. She left one more. "Mr. Caldwell," he said, his voice barely above the ambient ticking. "Not for the court. Not for the clocks. For you." I took the envelope from his hands, feeling the slight weight of whatever lay inside. Her handwriting on the front was not hurried like the warning card, or precise like the journal. It was gentle, unhurried. The script of a woman writing not against a deadline but toward a person she loved. I held it against my chest, feeling my own heartbeat beneath the paper, and realized that the mechanism was not quite finished. One final gear remained to turn, and this one had nothing to do with justice. I opened the envelope in the vault. Alone, with only the sound of 200 clocks for company. It felt appropriate to read her voice here. In the cathedral, she had built word by word, and gear by gear, over 6 years of solitary devotion. The amber light caught the cream paper as I unfolded it, and the scent of sandalwood and old adhesive rose from the page like a ghost made of perfume. But the letter was not addressed to me. "My beautiful boy," it began, and my breath caught in my chest like a mechanism seizing. She had not written this for Warren Caldwell. She had written it for Marcus. I almost folded it closed. The instinct to protect myself from further pain was strong, a reflex developed over 3 weeks of institutional survival. But Miriam had placed this letter in Reggie's hands with the instruction to deliver it after everything was finished, after the clocks had spoken, after the law had acted, after the dust of the detonation had settled. She wanted me to read it in the aftermath, when the anger had cooled enough for the truth beneath it to be visible. "My beautiful boy, I built these walls not to punish you, but because I could not stop loving you enough to let you destroy yourself and your father. I watched you change. I watched the gears inside you strip and grind, until the mechanism I brought into this world no longer kept accurate time. I do not know when it began. Perhaps it was gradual, the way corrosion works on brass if left unpolished. Perhaps it was sudden, a mainspring snapping under tension I failed to notice. Either way, I am your mother, and I saw it. I saw the debt eating you alive. I saw the desperation turning you into someone your childhood self would not recognize. I had to stop reading. My hands were shaking in a way they had not shaken even in the courtroom. This was not evidence or strategy. This was a mother's heart laid bare on paper, the one document in the entire system that served no legal purpose and carried no tactical weight. It existed solely because Miriam could not stop being his mother even while engineering his defeat. "I know you will hate me when the clocks open," she continued. "I know you will see this as betrayal rather than protection. But Warren, I want you to understand something that Marcus cannot yet comprehend. I did not build 7 clocks to destroy my son. I built them to stop him before his destruction became irreversible. Prison is not my wish for him, but prison is survivable. The men he owed money to are not. If he had succeeded in liquidating the estate, the funds would have disappeared into debts that regenerate faster than they resolve. He would have lost everything within 18 months and found himself owing more than he started with to people who do not file legal petitions. They file obituaries." The revelation struck me with a force that rearranged the architecture of my understanding. Miriam had not just been protecting me. She had been protecting Marcus from the consequences of his own success. If his scheme had worked, if I had been committed and the estate liquidated, the money would have vanished into a debt structure designed to be infinite. The gambling syndicates Marcus owed would have consumed every dollar and demanded more. Her trap was not just justice. It was intervention. She was saving him by stopping him. The walls were not punishment. They were a cage, built to keep a self-destructive animal from running off a cliff. I read the final paragraph through vision blurred with a grief more complex than anything I had experienced at her funeral. "Someday, when the clockwork of your life slows down, I hope you will hear the silence and understand. I hope you will find the patience to learn a craft that does not consume everything it touches. I hope you will remember that your mother's hands were not just capable of building traps. They were capable of building beautiful things. And I hope, my boy, that somewhere in the years ahead, you will let someone teach you the difference between winding and breaking. I sat in the vault for an hour after finishing the letter. The clocks ticked around me with their patient mechanical rhythm, each one a word she had chosen to preserve against the erosion of time. I thought about the woman who had carried a death sentence and a son's betrayal simultaneously, who had engineered a system of justice while also engineering a system of mercy, and who had trusted me to deliver the mercy after the justice was complete. The next morning, I called Nathan Chen. He answered with the brisk efficiency I had grown accustomed to, but his voice softened when I told him what I needed. The federal penitentiary in Atlanta, Marcus's inmate mailing address. Nathan was quiet for a moment. Then he told me something I had not known. Miriam had, in the final months before her stroke, quietly prepaid the remaining 3 years of the mortgage on Marcus's studio apartment in Atlanta. She had done this through a separate trust that Jade and Marcus had never discovered, ensuring that regardless of what happened with the estate, her son would have a roof over his head when he eventually emerged from whatever consequence his actions delivered. She loved him to the end, Nathan said. Even while she was building the mechanism to stop him, she never stopped being his mother. I ended the call and sat at the kitchen table, the winter morning light painting the cabin floor in pale geometric patterns. Outside, the first snow of the season had begun to fall, soft and silent, covering the granite road and the workshop roof and the dormant garden beds in a layer of white that made everything look new, unwritten, clean. I took a fresh envelope from the desk drawer and placed Miriam's letter inside. I addressed it in my own handwriting to the Federal Correctional Institution in Atlanta, inmate number that Nathan had provided. I did not add a note of my own. The letter was not mine to annotate. It belonged to a conversation between a mother and her son that I could witness, but not enter. I walked to the mailbox at the end of the granite road, my boots leaving dark impressions in the fresh snow. The metal door of the mailbox creaked as I opened it, the sound sharp and singular in the mountain silence. I placed the envelope inside and raised the red flag. She loved him enough to build the walls, I said to the empty road, my breath forming small clouds in the December air. I love him enough to leave the door unlocked. The snow continued to fall as I walked back to the cabin, each flake arriving with the patient silence of a mechanism that has completed its primary function and now operates simply because it was built to endure. The clocks in the vault below the workshop kept their rhythm, measuring the minutes of a morning that asked nothing of me except to exist in it. And for the first time in months, that was enough. Spring arrived in the Blue Ridge the way sound returns to a room after the last note of a symphony fades. Gradually, then all at once, the snow receded from the granite road in slow retreat, revealing the dark, wet stone beneath like a stage being cleared for a new performance. The dormant garden beds along the cabin path erupted in early crocuses, their purple and yellow heads pushing through the thawing earth with a determination that reminded me of mainsprings releasing stored energy after a long winter of compression. 3 months had passed since the courthouse. 3 months of silence, of healing, of learning to inhabit my own property, without the constant background frequency of threat. I had spent the first week simply walking the rows of the workshop, walking the perimeter of the land, walking the vault in slow circuits, listening to the 200 clocks without trying to decode their messages or anticipate their warnings. They were no longer sentinels. They were simply companions, keeping time in a life that finally belonged to no one's schedule but my own. But silence, I discovered, is not a sustainable frequency for a man who has spent 61 years surrounded by sound. By February, the quiet had begun to feel less like healing and more like an empty studio waiting for its next session. Miriam had built this place for a purpose beyond protection, and as I reread her journal in the softer light of a life no longer under siege, I found the passage that unlocked the next movement. A clock that sits unwound in a glass case is not preserved, she had written. It is abandoned. These mechanisms were built to work. Find hands that need purpose, Warren. Give them something precise and patient to restore. The idea arrived fully formed, the way the best recordings happen. Not through force, but through the sudden alignment of elements that had been waiting in proximity. I contacted the Veterans Affairs Regional Office in Asheville, and within 2 weeks, I was connected with a program coordinator named Sandra, who specialized in occupational therapy for combat veterans with post-traumatic stress. When I described what I was offering, a workshop in horological restoration for veterans seeking a meditative, precision-based recovery practice, her silence lasted 4 full seconds before she said the word yes with such force that I could hear the smile through the phone. We called it clockwork recovery. Reggie and I converted the workshop's upper floor into a teaching space, installing 6 individual workbenches with magnification lamps, tool sets, and practice movements sourced from a supplier in Ohio who specialized in educational horology kits. The room smelled of fresh-cut pine from the new shelving and the warm mineral scent of brass shavings that would soon accumulate in the collection trays. The first cohort arrived on a Tuesday in early March. 3 men, each one carrying damage that no clock mechanism could fully represent, but that the discipline of restoration might begin to address. There was Samuel, 43. A former helicopter mechanic whose hands shook from medication side effects but whose mechanical intuition was immediately apparent. There was Jerome, 51, a retired sergeant who had not slept more than 4 hours in a single stretch since 2009, and who said he came because he heard the repetitive motion helped. And there was Thomas. Thomas was 28. He had lost his left hand to an improvised explosive device in Kandahar province 4 years ago. He arrived with a prosthetic that he wore but rarely used, preferring to manage the world with his remaining right hand, and a stubbornness that I recognized as the particular defiance of a man who refuses to be defined by subtraction. He sat at his workbench on that first morning and studied the disassembled 1950 practice movement with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. I taught them the way Miriam's journal had taught me. Start with the mainspring. Understand the source of power before attempting to channel it. Learn the names of every component: barrel, arbor, click, ratchet wheel. Feel the tension in your fingers before you see it in the metal. A clock does not care about your past. It only cares about the precision of your present. The first week was frustration. Dropped screws and bent hairsprings and the particular curse words that men use when their bodies refuse to cooperate with their intentions. But by the second week, something shifted. The room grew quieter. Not the empty silence of suppression, but the focused silence of concentration. Samuel's hands steadied when they held a pair of tweezers. Jerome fell asleep at his bench one afternoon, his head resting beside a partially assembled barrel, and slept for 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in 14 years. And Thomas. On the 14th day, Thomas placed the final wheel into the gear train of his practice movement, secured the bridge plate, and wound the mainspring with his single hand. The click of the ratchet was clean, precise. Exactly the sound it was designed to make. He released the crown, and the balance wheel began to oscillate. The tick filled the room with its small, perfect voice. Thomas stared at the mechanism for a long time. Then he looked up at me, and his eyes held something I recognized from my own reflection in the vault glass on the day I first heard 200 clocks speaking in unison. "It is the first thing I have fixed since I came home," he said, his voice rough with a weight that had nothing to do with volume, that did not break again the next morning. I placed my hand on his shoulder, feeling the solid architecture of a young man who was learning to build rather than brace. Reggie stood in the doorway, his arms crossed, his weathered face wearing an expression I had never seen on him before. Pride. Not the sharp, possessive pride of ownership. The quiet, structural pride of a man watching a foundation cure. Nathan called that afternoon to inform me that Miriam's patent on her proprietary restoration methodology had been approved posthumously. The licensing royalties from 3 European horological institutions would generate enough annual income to fund the clockwork recovery program indefinitely. She had ensured the workshop would outlive us all. That evening, as I was locking the workshop for the night, Reggie handed me a letter that had arrived in the afternoon mail. The return address was the Federal Correctional Institution in Atlanta. Marcus's inmate number was printed in the upper corner in the institutional font that reduces every human being to a catalog entry. I opened it, standing on the workshop porch, the spring air carrying the scent of new growth and wet earth. Marcus's handwriting was smaller than I remembered, compressed, as if the physical space of his confinement had translated into the dimensions of his script. Dad. I read Mom's letter. I do not deserve your time or your forgiveness. But I need to ask you something. If you ever build another clock in that workshop, if you ever teach another person how to make something keep time instead of losing it, could you teach me? Not now. I know I have years before that is possible, but someday, could you teach me how not to break things? I folded the letter and held it against the railing, watching the last light of the day paint the Blue Ridge in shades of amber and violet. A broken clock is not worthless. Miriam had once written. It is just waiting for the right hands to find it again. I did not know if Marcus could be restored. I did not know if the gears inside him could be realigned, or if the mainspring had snapped beyond repair, but I knew that his mother had left him a door, and I had delivered it, and I knew that somewhere in the years ahead, if the mechanism of his reformation ever began to tick with genuine precision, there would be a workbench waiting for him in the mountains of North Carolina. A mainspring is the heart of every clock. Without it, the gears are just metal. With it, even the oldest mechanism remembers how to keep time. The evening of the inauguration arrived with a sky so clear that the stars over Blue Ridge looked like the luminous dial of some celestial timepiece. Nearly 60 people gathered on the granite drive, their voices creating a layered frequency of celebration that vibrated through the wooden boards beneath my feet. Thomas stood near the workshop door, his single hand holding a glass of cider with a steadiness that would have been impossible 4 months ago. Jerome was telling stories to a cluster of counselors, animated in a way that suggested sleep had become a friend rather than an enemy. I gave a short speech from the porch. My wife was the architect of this place, I said. I am just the superintendent making sure the foundation holds. I spoke about time not as a thief, but as a material that can be shaped by patient hands. The Miriam Caldwell Horological Center, I concluded, lifting my glass. Built by a woman who understood that the most important mechanisms are the ones you cannot see. Gradually, the headlights carved paths down the granite road, and the mountain reclaimed its silence. Reggie found me on the porch after the last car disappeared. He carried something cradled with a tenderness that told me its weight was not physical. A pocket watch, sterling silver, worn to a soft patina by decades of handling. I recognized it immediately. Miriam had worn this watch on our wedding day, pinned inside her dress against her heart. She told me she wanted time itself to witness our vows from the closest possible distance. She gave it to me 3 years ago, Reggie said. She said it was not ready yet, that the mechanism needed one more modification before it could be delivered. I pressed the crown. The case opened with the familiar click of a well-maintained hinge. Behind the face, where the movement should have been visible, Reggie had installed a small compartment sealed with a magnetic catch. I opened it. Inside sat a miniature audio chip, activated by exposure to air, and my wife's voice filled the vault for the last time. Warren, if you are hearing this, it means you survived the storm I could not protect you from in person. It means the clock spoke clearly enough. It means the mechanism worked. Her voice was calm, unhurried. The voice of a woman speaking not from urgency, but from love. Every clock in this room is a word I wished I had said at dinner. Every gear is an I love you that I saved for this moment because I was too busy building the future to stop and speak in the present. You spent your life listening to the world's frequencies. I hope now, in this silence, you can finally hear mine. Build something beautiful, my love. Time is not running out. It is just beginning. The chip fell silent. 200 clocks filled the space her voice left behind. their patient mechanical hearts beating in unison like an orchestra sustaining a final chord. I closed the watch and held it against my chest, feeling my pulse beating in counterpoint to the mechanisms surrounding me. I placed the pocket watch on the central pedestal of the empty bulletproof case, where clock number 7 had once stood. The silver caught the amber light like a small, steady star. Then I climbed the stairs and stepped out onto the porch. The Blue Ridge was wrapped in thin morning fog, the ridgeline appearing and disappearing like the outline of a future still being written. I did not check for cracks in the foundation. I did not scan the tree line for approaching headlights. I did not calculate the structural load of the coming day. I simply stood there, hands on the railing, and listened. Spring insects in the garden beds, the distant creek finding its way over ancient stone, the faint pulse of 200 clocks breathing beneath my feet, and beneath all of it, in a frequency that perhaps only I could hear, the steady, patient rhythm of a love that had outlived the woman who built it and would continue ticking long after both of us became part of the silence. Looking back on this journey, I must confront a truth that humbles me more than any courtroom ever could. I spent 40 years engineering sound, isolating frequencies, eliminating distortion, yet the most important signal in my life was broadcasting from 3 feet away, and I never tuned in. I confused silence with stability. I mistook routine for connection. The people who love you most are sometimes the ones building the loudest things in the quietest rooms. If someone in your family is reaching for what does not belong to them, do not wait for the mechanism to finish winding. Speak now. Protect your legacy not because it is valuable, but because it represents hours of someone's life that can never be recovered. And if you are carrying a weight alone because you believe your loved ones cannot bear it with you, remember this: a mainspring never allowed to unwind will eventually snap. Share the tension. Trust the structure you built together. What kept me standing through the darkest nights in Pinewood was not strategy or evidence. It was faith. Faith that the Lord's timing operated on a precision greater than any mechanism my wife had ever built. That character is forged under pressure, not comfort. That integrity endures long after predators exhaust themselves. If this story reached somewhere inside your chest, I would be grateful to hear where it landed. Tell me in the comments what moment stayed with you longest. If you believe someone in your life needs to hear this, share it before the clock runs out. Subscribe so you do not miss the next story. And remember what Miriam taught me: time is not running out. It is just beginning.